This is our program for the week of November 15th, 2024. We're just over a week since we learned that Donald Trump would be returning to the White House, and needless to say, every day has included another outlandish pick for his cabinet, with the recent picks of Matt Gaetz for Attorney General and RFK Jr. for Health and Human Services among the most quintessentially corrupt Trumpian picks one could imagine. But amidst all the sensationalism about this new cast of characters for the Real Life Apprentice Season 2, there are the not so quiet truths about how these picks will position the Trump administration on Gaza in the short and long run. In a piece yesterday in the Middle East Eye, David Hurst outlined the staunch pro Israel bent of Trump's cabinet picks, starting with Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, who's been staunchly opposed to a ceasefire, claiming that a ceasefire would be ineffective since Iran would, quote, continue to stoke unrest because they want to destroy Israel. Vivek Ramaswamy bragged that, quote, if left unrestrained, the IDF would be able to get the job done on defending Israel. Mike Huckabee, Trump's ambassador to Israel, denied the West Bank even existed or that there was an occupation. And Pete Hegseth, his Secretary of Defense and the former Fox News co-host, claimed that, quote, the West cannot have Iran with mullahs with a nuclear shield. And most of all, Marco Rubio, tapped for Secretary of State, has shown no signs of doing anything but following in the footsteps of his war criminal predecessor, Antony Blinken, saying Israel's enemies are also our enemies, while decrying the ICC's attempts to issue arrest warrants against Netanyahu and his accomplices. So there's plenty to unpack here about the implications of these cabinet picks on the prospects for peace and perhaps more appropriately escalating regional war. And I'm sure Samuel will do that in his PSA today and in future PSAs. But what we're seeing are deep challenges ahead for all of our movements working to end genocide as we move from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. And the inflammatory rhetoric of Trump and his picks will only be bolstered by the kind of political repression that the Heritage Foundation seeks to enact through Project Esther. We've mentioned Project Esther on our last few PSAs, and we are really lucky today to be joined by Dylan Saba from Palestine Legal. Dylan is a lawyer and a writer who's published in a variety of outlets from N+1 Magazine to Jewish Currents. And Dylan was recently featured in a Dropsite News article on Project Esther. And that piece by Ryan Grimm and Murtaza Hussain outlines a plan to criminalize dissent using America's counterterrorism apparatus to target nonprofits and student groups that organize in solidarity with Palestine. Dylan, it's great to have you with us today. Welcome to the Friday PSA.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so, before we get started talking about Project Esther and the threats ahead for people organizing around Palestine, I want to go back to this article you wrote last October when you published in N+1 magazine called A Surge in Suppression and subtitled It's Never Been This Bad. You wrote about some of the immediate backlash that various students and professionals were experiencing for speaking up for Palestine in those early days of the genocide, from Rainer Workman's removal as student body president at NYU, to the sports journalist Jackson Frank being fired from Philly Voice. And you called it a McCarthyist purge and lamented that, quote, a failure to stop this new McCarthyism would be to surrender to the forces of reaction that are tragically carrying the day. I'm wondering if you can reflect on what's been more than a year since you wrote those words, and where we are, in your estimation, when it comes to the suppression and repression of Palestine solidarity work. What's been lost, and in your estimation, what's maybe been gained, if anything at all?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's certainly been a hell of a year. I think, and also given that we now know the results of the election and can look ahead a bit, it is a good point in time in which to reflect on where we're at. I think that if I were to periodize, I think that the most useful framework is to think about the before October 7th period, and then the October 7th period ranging from last October up through January of next year. And then, we can talk about what to expect in the Trump era. And I think that those date markers are not necessarily markers of major qualitative shifts in repression and or even in organizing, but quantitative markers, really. So I think the way to think about um, my piece in October of saying it's never been this bad has really been it really was about the onslaught of repression that the movement was facing, and that remained relatively constant. So it's not that we necessarily were seeing new kinds of repression that we hadn't seen before October 7th. The tactics in the toolbox of Israel advocacy groups and Zionist organizations relatively the same, right? It is target people at their places of employment, try to get people fired by leveraging smears, and generally the smears. And this is kind of a broad lesson or kind of a broad kind of strategic approach of Israel advocacy groups is the smears come in two forms, right? It's either you are engaging in anti-Semitism or you are engaging in support for terrorism. That's like the overarching paradigm that all of the repression takes the form of. Um, so we saw, a massive uptick right after October 7th of those kinds of smears and allegations targeting people at their workplaces, targeting people, especially on college campuses. And we should talk about why that is, why the college campuses have become such an inflection point. Both for organizing and for the organized opposition. And when we talk about Project Esther, we'll talk about why that program also is very focused um, on the campus. But so we saw a big quantitative spike, right, in the number of instances of repression that we've seen, and that largely did. I mean, it was really, really bad in the fall, but it did really continue through the spring. So I would say that the like immediate wave of firings in workplaces, which was really pronounced in the fall of 2023, that dissipated a bit. And the focus of repression really started narrowing in on the college campus. And we saw a kind of like obsessive focus with universities and what they were, quote unquote, tolerating on their campuses. And part of the reason for that is that the activist movement in the US around Palestine, while not, certainly not exclusively on college campuses, has been largely incubated there over the past several decades. It's been where a lot of the organizing has been, and a lot of organizing campaigns have a kind of like campus component, and this poses a kind of particular threat to Israel advocacy groups because they may assess correctly that they have a pretty strong lock on political power, in that there are not threats from within, like, national level institutional halls of power. You maybe have a handful of Congress people who are advocating for cutting aid to Israel, but it's basically a drop in the bucket compared to like all of the people that AIPAC has in their pocket. But that's not the case on college campuses. On college campuses, and particularly the campuses of elite universities that Zionist Israel advocacy groups like perceive as the site of reproduction of the next ruling class, right? The fact that Palestine is so popular there, and you see all of this campus level organizing, represents a threat to the long-term interests of the U.S. Israel, of maintaining and sustaining the U.S. Israel relationship. So I think that's like in part what explains in broad terms like the focus on the campus. And then in the period after October 7th, there was a very material and concrete existential threat that they perceived to the state of Israel, and it meant that continued U.S. support for Israel's genocidal war, in their view, is an existential issue for them and the maintenance of the U.S.-Israeli relationship and the maintenance of the Israeli colonial project, right? So the fact that there was this massive upswell of dissent on campuses and elsewhere of people saying like, hey, we actually want to question this relationship. We don't think this is good. We don't think this is in our interest. We don't think it's moral. We think it's violating, basic decency, human rights law. We want to withdraw our own complicity in upholding this relationship, cause those groups to really double and triple down and crack down in every way they could on campus organizing. Now, over the course of the year, a couple things happened. One, the student movement really ballooned, right? So there's been like a steady increase in organizing around Palestine over the past couple of decades. And then it was just a total explosion, right? After October 7th. It became a mainstream issue. It became something that young people in particular around the country knew and had an opinion on because they were being exposed to the horrors of Israel's genocide on a daily basis on social media and what have you. On the one hand, there was this institutional crackdown to try and stamp out dissent, and at the same time, there was this upswell of grassroots organizing and popular support, which then catalyzed even further repression, right? So the attempt to repress, the failure of that attempt, the explosion of organizing at the grassroots level, feeds into the already existent existential fears of Zionist groups, Israel advocacy groups in the U.S., feeding the need for even further repression. And what we saw, especially in the spring, thinking about the encampments, is that repression catalyzes even further organizing, right? So the fact that Colombia was motivated to call in, militarized police to come and brutalize student organizers on their campus created this iconic image and this iconic tactic that then was replicated and spread all over the country. So it's kind of this like, you know, vicious, virtuous, whatever cycle um, that has brought us to this current moment. And then the last piece, and then I'll kick it back to you for another question. But the last piece that I want to weave in here, because I think it's really relevant in thinking forward to a Trump administration, is that a lot of these panics around elite institutions as an incubator for radical thought or critique of US role in the world, American hegemony, what have you, dovetailed really neatly with existing conservative right-wing cultural panic around what's happening at the elite institutions and quote unquote wokeness and what have you. So there actually was an entire body of rhetoric and people positioned to make these arguments because they had already been drumming up a panic around critical race theory and wokeness and what have you over the past 3 years in the kind of like post George Floyd moment that we're all stuck inside of.
Yeah, no, and I think the irony, and we'll get to this in a second, is that as much as they talk about the woke machine, the anti-woke machine is actually the one that's really humming in terms of the kind of focus and the projects that are targeted in on this threat that you're naming, which is both specific in this instance to Israel and then also to the broader right-wing project. We there's a lot there that I would love to follow up with you on, but I want to get to talking about the actual document, Project Esther document, and then also what it portends. The Heritage Foundation, Dylan, is, it's all up in this administration's planning. They're the authors of Project 2025. We expect them to have folks in federal positions across government. They published this national strategy to combat anti-Semitism, which is Project Esther, on the anniversary of October 7th. As we were joking around before we started, it starts off by citing the Torah and specifically the Book of Esther, and tells the story about Haman, the vizier to the Persian king, and his plot to kill every Jew in Persia. And then, unbeknownst to him, the king's wife, Queen Esther, was also Jewish, and she convinces the king to stop the plot and instead have Haman and his family hanged. It identifies that Israel, standing in for Jewish people everywhere, is now facing another Haman, with the not so subtle suggestion that Haman is Hamas, is Palestine, is the Palestinian people. And within this document, there are, there's some bizarre kind of rhetoric being used, but it's a very serious and very targeted document in terms of what it's trying to achieve. There are some clear end goals that have to do with targeting the infrastructure of Palestine solidarity and trying to really isolate it and eradicate it from American discourse and also physically from American society. Help us unpack this. Help us understand a little bit about, what this document means to you and what exactly they're laying out here in Project Esther.
Yeah. So I think the most useful way to think about what this is, because I agree, like when you read it, it seems insane. There's like a litany of various acronyms. It's kind of like filtered through this like consultant speak, but has this kind of like fatalist, you know, biblical orientation to it. And it is a bit confusing, but I think that fundamentally, the way to think about what this is and what it's trying to do is to get around the protections of the First Amendment, fundamentally. Because that, from the perspective of the Israel advocacy groups and, right-wing think tanks and what have you, the actual problem, as I've kind of like laid out already, is that you have a large and growing number of people who don't think that the US should be supporting Israel in their genocide of Palestinians. And maybe don't think that the US should have a foundational relationship with Israel at all. Maybe thinks that Israel is a pariah state and ought to be treated as such, and is not in U.S. interests to have that be our like number one regional ally, right? So all things that are very reasonable positions to hold, and very squarely within the framework of political dissent, political opinion, political ideology. These are views. These are, and they may be, um, uh, they're views that are held by, people of particular subject position or what have you, but fundamentally it doesn't matter, right? We are talking about an idea, and the perpetuation of the idea and advocacy for that idea. That is squarely what the free speech protections and free association protections of the First Amendment are meant to protect. And so in order to get around that, there needs to be another scheme, right? Another explanation for what's actually happening. And so what they have constructed with Project Esther, which by the way, I don't think is a unique threat in that it is fundamentally what they're already doing. So this is not like some program that they are rolling out. This is them putting down on paper their approach to Palestine organizing in the US and what their approach has been to Palestine organizing in the US. Which is, on the one hand, it's like, I say that so that people don't panic about a boogeyman, but I mean, it is pretty scary. And it is pretty bold of them to write this all down and put it out there in this way, because they're very explicit that, like, as you said, like they want to shut down this discourse. They want to take away the ability for these groups to make this argument. And they want to pretend like these are not actually just organic formations at the level of the grassroots of people who genuinely dissent from U.S. policy. So it's not something new, but what they are trying to do is craft in language and in narrative that end run around the First Amendment. And so that's why they are building out a conspiracy. Like this actually is a real conspiracy theory that they are formulating here by calling, giving this moniker of HSO and HSN, where like each, quote unquote, Hamas supporting organization is a node in the Hamas supporting network, right? What they are trying to do is fabricate linkages between legitimate, independent grassroots organizations in the US and designated foreign terrorist groups, to pull that activity in under the umbrella of the U.S. counterterrorism regime, right? And the counterterrorism regime has components in terms of like the Department of Treasury, like sanctions laws, and also like the criminal code for material support for terrorism organizations. And so what they're trying to do is fabricate the conditions such that they can take activity that is fully, totally protected by the First Amendment, um, and try to lay some groundwork for either criminal prosecutions, designations, what have you. And to do so, they do need they are like they are building out a kind of like conspiratorial web, not unlike we've seen um, we've seen kind of like similar attempts in terms of the alleged conspiracies around like the Stop Cop City movement and the like attempts to bring in RICO charges, or those kind of like legal frameworks. We can see different authorities at different levels experimenting. And to be clear, Project Esther Heritage Foundation is not a government authority. This is a private think tank. But it's a clue for where right-wing folks want to go with this, and we do know that it is like likely to influence policy on some level within the Trump administration. But we kind of see the direction that these forces are going, which is to take protected activity and use both the counterterrorism regime and also anti-discrimination law, right? So they're also saying like the kind of prime thrust of this is that um, this is about combating anti-Semitism, right? And like I said at the beginning, right, the kind of like two-headed dragon of these kind of false accusations is to make false accusations of anti-Semitism, and false accusations of support for terrorism. So that's, I think, the way, broadly speaking, to understand what this is. It is an intervention, not necessarily to create new policies, but to direct the repressive policies in such a way that it sets up this end run around the First Amendment that I'm talking about.
Dylan, thanks. I mean, I think it's important to emphasize your initial point that, this is happening right now, and there is something extraordinary about the nature in which it's being articulated. But make no mistake about it, this has been the game plan along from the Zionist lobby and from the U.S. government as it's currently constituted under the Biden administration. This is not all something new. But let's talk about that in that same vein. Let's talk about the defense, right? Like what's, you're at Pal Legal. You don't necessarily have to get into the weeds about the jurisprudence with us today, but maybe if you could answer this or take us down like sort of two aspects of this, which is one is, from the legal standpoint, what do you expect to be sort of those protections that hold and that are going to be challenged? And what does that mean for people that will come to PAL Legal, or for folks that are organizing that are looking for legal support around this? And then secondarily, once we get through that a little bit, if you could walk us through a little bit of not only what PAL Legal and what you advise folks, but what you would say would be the recommended approach for preparing for this for people that are involved in the solidarity work, which is, I think, mitigating folks' sense of alarm and fear while keeping them soberly like focused on, okay, this is something legitimately bad, is a key aspect over the next few weeks to get people to continue to come out, to continue to be doing this important work.
Yeah, I mean, I think trying to figure out how to strike that appropriate balance between encouraging caution and not chilling people away from engaging in advocacy has been a major challenge for us as we try to navigate this moment amid a tremendous amount of uncertainty. So, like, it may have been the calculation let's say a year and a half ago, may have been different. And this may be not something that I would want to even speak about publicly because of how the risk of chill. When I say chill, I mean information that motivates people away from mobilizing, rightly or wrongly. Um, So it's difficult, and the other thing, the other kind of like lawyerly answer I'm going to give you here is that it like really, really, really depends on the context of your organization, right? So the universal advice that I can share is that any organization that is involved in Palestine work, and honestly, any progressive cause. I mean, like, you know what I mean? Like, if we're thinking about what the Trump administration is going to look like, yes, Palestine will probably be at the forefront given where we're at conjuncturally. But I think that um, any organizing collective, nonprofit, what have you, should be thinking about where are the risks and vulnerabilities in your work, in thinking about the period that's to come. Now, I can't, from this vantage point here on this call, I can't really explain how how each individual group should be doing that assessment, but I don't need to, right? So that like there are resources in the movement. So, for example, if you are a group that engages in Palestine advocacy, and you have reason to think that you're in the crosshairs of any of this kind of stuff, and that can be from, a state actor, obviously very serious, but a lot of this stuff um, is in the hand of private third party actors. So like, when we think about the counterterrorism regime, like, you may think about getting a charge, being charged criminally, and but by a prosecutor or what have you. But these laws also have civil provisions for civil litigation that can empower private actors to bring lawsuits, and that has been a strategy of Zionist organizations, is to drag nonprofits into this like litigious process that, even though it does not successfully, because of the legal protections that do exist, does not actually result in a finding of liability, can still you know burden an organization for a long time. So what I would say is that organizations should be doing internal risk assessments and reaching out to organizations like Palestine Legal if you need help on that front, because there is a kind of like robust network of attorneys that are thinking about these issues. We are trying at Palestine Legal. We are trying, and have been doing a lot of tailored know your rights presentations, to get in to think kind of concretely and specifically about how to talk about these issues publicly, where to be careful, what are the kind of like patterns of repression. But yeah, at the top line, I would say reach out to attorneys, to other groups, in order to kind of assess your organization's needs and plans for the next year. And then the other piece that I would really encourage is to think about cross movement solidarity building, and cross group relationships, because we don't actually know what's going to happen, right? There's a lot of stuff that possibly could happen, but we don't know what the order of operations are going to be. We don't know whether there's going to be, nothing, whether there's going to be a wave of groups targeted, whether there's going to be, one after the other. And the stronger the relationships that our groups in the kind of broader collective movement and scene have with each other, the better we will be able to adapt and respond to crises as they happen, or to groups getting targeted as they happen. Because a major strategy, and I will point out, this is actually in the Project Esther document, is that they want to make the movement not trust each other. This is literally what they say. They want to sow division, and they want to sow discord. And one way to do that is to target some people and not target other people, right? And try to motivate people to turn on each other. We need to inoculate ourselves against that, and we need to not let that tactic succeed. And and that means being in community, or at least conversation, um, in contact with groups in our ecosystem, and it maybe that we don't see eye to eye on tactically, right? And that can be a challenge, but that is one thing that I think that, in addition to doing like a risk assessment, that's one thing that movement groups can think about, in the next couple of months before Trump admin comes to power.
Dylan, thanks so much. I want to head over to Samurai. I know you have some follow-up questions a little bit about the targeting of how this relates to sort of the specific targeting of nonprofits.
Yeah, first of all, just want to say thanks. This was very enlightening. Obviously, a question that a lot of us in the movement have been wrestling with for the past couple of weeks in particular. But yeah, I just reflecting on the idea that a lot of the discourse, particularly in Project Esther and with this like new House bill, to strip nonprofits of their status, seems to be focused specifically on like 501(c)(3) nonprofits. Like, how much do you think that that's a specific avenue of repression? Like, are other types of organizations a little bit more insulated? Like, is there less that they can do other than, either at the small end, like stripping people of their status, and at the broad end, obviously like the big scary MST stuff. But yeah, is there like more space to operate outside of those nonprofit structures?
That's a good question, and I actually want to refrain from giving an affirmative answer, because the truth is I don't know. I don't know. What I know is what we see them doing. And I wouldn't want to just like encourage folks to, you know, abandon the C3 structure because it's safer. That may be the case. That may be the case. And we are certainly seeing them go after it now. And my read is that it's because it's a relatively easy thing for them to do. I think that there is a lot of leeway in terms of, designations under OFAC, like the, entity responsible for um, administering the, tax law within the Department of Treasury. Um, and there's a lot that can be done on that front just from, the pen of an executive order, basically. And so I think that is the first place to think defensively. I will say also, like, it's also not the end of the world. Like, there are other formulations, there are other ways to associate with one another. And so, if C3s are getting targeted, we will adapt and we will figure out what the next play is. But my read is a cautious one, which is that I want to wait and see kind of how this develops before rushing to tell everyone that they need to get out of the C3 space. But this is a kind of conversation that I encourage each individual group to be having with an attorney, because it really is not, it cannot be discussed independent of that risk assessment piece that I'm talking about, right? Because there are groups that are going to be more vulnerable than others, and it's more vulnerable because of who they are and how much they piss off Zionist groups, and because of the kind of because of the kind of work that they're involved in, right? What does the organization do? A legal service provider is going to have a totally different set of things to think about than a community organization that does pub ed teach-ins in a specific geographic location, right? It just looks totally different. But yeah, I mean, that House Bill 9495 advancing is certainly a cause for concern, and I think, frankly, we just have to assume that is what is going to be passed into law, if not in the fall, then in January.
Thanks so much for sharing time with us and doing this download on Project Esther, and uh, let us know where folks can reach out to Paralegal and other resources that might be of help as they're doing some of this planning for the next couple of weeks and months.
Yeah, totally. So sorry, there's some background noise here. But yeah, on our website, palestinelegal.org, there is an intake form. So if you need legal advice, you should fill out that intake form. Can be on behalf of an individual or behalf of an organization. If you're an attorney watching this, by the way, and you want to contribute to our work as a part of our attorney network, there's space on our website where you can fill out that form and get connected with us, because a lot of times what we're doing is referring out cases that come to us. We don't have a ton of attorneys fully on staff. So you can join our attorney network. And for miscellaneous questions, you can email info@palestinelegal.org. But yeah, and again, I really want to emphasize and encourage people. Don't, I don't want you to construe anything that I have said on this call as me giving you legal advice, right? But we can support you. So if you have particular questions, please come to us, or another attorney that you trust, and talk about your situation specifically. But I do think it's important, as you all are doing, and I'm really grateful for raising these issues in a public way, because we do need to be having this also as a movement-wide conversation.
Thanks again, Dylan. We're just so grateful for Paralegal's work and for your time. And you can keep, and Dylan is on one of the many of the social media sites and is writing. We'll share some of that information in our post-call notes. But thanks again for joining us, Dylan.
Thank you so much.
All right, Samer. So now let's talk a little bit about the events of the last week. So much to catch up on, and without much ado, I'm going to hand it over to you to take us through it.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, we have a little chunk of time, and so I'll probably just jump right in. I will say that I did put together the full set of slides, but we of course won't have time to go through them. So I would encourage folks to check them out when they get a chance after this. They get emailed out to everybody who has signed up, I hope. So skipping over some of like the high level stuff, another 500 or so dead this week in both Palestine and Lebanon, mostly in Lebanon this past week where a lot of things have happened. I'm going to skip the local analysis, but just to say it's the usual campaigns of bombings and displacements. Some pretty horrific airstrikes, including some attacks on aid delivery recipients, which again is not a new thing, but a thing that we continue to see. The one thing that I did want to touch on quickly was this sort of new accelerated expectation of annexation of the West Bank. Now that Marco Rubio has been appointed the new Secretary of State and has openly said that he's in favor of this annexation. He's calling it Judea and Samaria. And so like the right-wing Israeli ministers are talking about this being the year of the total annexation of the West Bank. I think it's inevitable, given the sort of situation we're in now, that there will be some level of annexation happening, whether it's, the sort of accelerated version of the land grabs that have been happening, or something that's a little bit broader and more systemic. Right now it's a little too early to say, but it's certainly not looking good. A new UN report from the Human Rights Commission, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, labeling what Israel has been doing as in very careful UN language, they call it warfare methods consistent with the genocide. It's particularly interesting. It's a very powerful report, by the way, that I would definitely recommend folks check out. It covers all the different pieces, from the deliberate attacks on social infrastructure to the like forced starvation of broad groups of people, the use of AI for targeting and assassinations, the media censorship. Like it really covers the broad swath of things that Israel has done. And the report actually only covers last October to July. And you all know how much worse things have gotten since July. So even just looking at that slice, the findings here are really damning. Perhaps our last update on the Gaza ceasefires. I wouldn't be surprised if it was, given that Qatar has now officially suspended its role as the mediator in these negotiations. This seems to be a product of US pressure, which is a little ironic given that it was the United States that had pushed Qatar in the first place. to house Hamas, to like sort of support them and provide a place where the U.S. could engage with them indirectly. But the U.S. now appears to be telling Qatar to stop mediating the ceasefire negotiations, and according to some sources, has told Qatar to kick the Hamas office out of the country. That part doesn't seem very verified to me. Hamas has denied it. There have been a few reports like this in the past, so I think it's a little early to know whether or not that piece is actually happening. But for all intents and purposes, I would say, like at this point, the ceasefire process in Gaza is officially dead. And like by the, explicit aim of the United States, like there's just no interest in it anymore. On the Lebanon side, things are looking a little different on the ceasefire front. The new Israeli defense minister that has replaced fired Minister Yoav Gallant is saying that Israel has like achieved its military objectives in Lebanon. This is something that Israel has been saying about Gaza for about 8 months now, so you should definitely take that with a grain of salt. But what we should interpret that as is a pretty clear indication that they are trying to lay the groundwork for a ceasefire and to like build public support for a ceasefire. So that does seem to be something that's building up. Folks may have seen this absolutely bone-chilling revelation in the Washington Post, I think just yesterday, basically saying that Israel is planning on doing a ceasefire in Lebanon as an early gift to Donald Trump. Like obviously the Israeli government and frankly the Israeli public are thrilled about the Trump presidency, so it's not super surprising that they are going out of their way to provide some support. Ron Dermer, who flew to the United States to talk about the situation in Lebanon, actually went to Mar-a-Lago first to meet with Trump and then went to the White House to meet with Biden, just to give you a sense of like how quickly they sort of shifted their sense of political priorities. And the idea here basically is that Trump wants the situation basically done as soon as possible so that he doesn't have to be perceived as being pushed to put any pressure on Israel. And so they're basically describing it. The Israeli government is describing it as a gift to Trump. What that looks like, we don't necessarily know. It sounds like maybe there's going to be a temporary ceasefire in place for the next 2 months. There's some talk of a 60-day ceasefire so that the fighting can stop more or less right away, but the actual signing of the final sort of status agreement would happen under Trump's presidency. So this is just like an attempt to bolster him. I don't know if they actually care what Trump wants for the record, but obviously he is very susceptible to that kind of like flattery. So, they're playing him well already. The question that remains is whether Hezbollah is going to agree to the ceasefire or not, and that remains deeply unclear. Uh, the US and Israel are saying that they're very optimistic, so presumably there are some signs here. The ceasefire agreement is, based on the existing, we've talked many weeks now about, UN Resolution 1701, which basically says Hezbollah forces retreat above the Litani River and Israel withdraws all forces from the country. The problem with the current ceasefire proposal that's being put out is the same issue that it's had for the last month, which is Israel wants Hezbollah to withdraw, but it wants to be able to stay. And so that seems to be like a non-starter. So unless Israel pulls that out of its proposal, it feels like the fact that they're confident on their side about a ceasefire doesn't actually mean anything unless they compromise something that Hezbollah is saying is a sort of red line. So we'll see what happens to that. I think very soon, probably in the next week, we'll see some movement on this. Meanwhile, inside Israel itself, Netanyahu is like facing a series of giant scandals. I assumed when I first saw this article on the left that it was about the leaks that we talked about last week, these sort of faked documents saying that Hamas didn't want a ceasefire. And it is partly about that, but it's also about Netanyahu doctoring the official phone record on October 7th, saying that, he was a general called him to say that an attack was imminent. And so he like removed that phone call from the phone records and then apparently got some sort of damning video footage of the official who's in charge of the phone records and used that to blackmail him into deleting the records. Like it's a crazy story. You should read it. So it's those three things: the fake documents, and then the the phone records and the blackmail of the person with the phone records. And then separate from all of that is Netanyahu's corruption trial for bribery and fraud, where he's supposed to be testifying in December, but he's asking for a 2 month delay so that he can manage the war. But like again, right, this is him sort of playing out his own political ambitions in the face of a lot of these issues that are seem to be compounding for him. And speaking of right-wing nut jobs with compounding ethical issues, obviously we've seen a whole host of Trump moves on the Palestine front and a bunch of other things. Thomas talked about this a little bit at the top, so I won't spend much time on it. These are two really good threads that I found to sort of like really dig into on the left, like who in the cabinet Trump has already appointed and their sort of Israel positions. And on the right, specifically looking at Mike Huckabee and the things that he's said about Israel in particular. You'll notice the links for these, I'm using something that doesn't give any traffic to Twitter, and I'm trying to move off of the Bird app as much as humanly possible. So you'll see me try to use Blue Sky posts and things in the future, but they make it hard. The other thing I wanted to note about this is there's been a lot of focus on the appointments Trump has been making, but it's also important to reflect a little bit on the appointments that Netanyahu is making for Trump, right? So, the old Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Michael Herzog, is leaving, and his replacement is Yahya Leiter, I think his name is. He's a former member of the like Jewish Defense Organization, like an actual terrorist organization, even by United States standards, who's like a hard settlement activist whose whole thing is annexing the West Bank. And so his appointment, I think, tells us quite a bit. Meanwhile, in addition to the cabinet appointments, Trump has appointed Stephen Witkoff, I think his name is the new Middle East envoy, who's like not a person who has any sort of diplomatic experience. He's another real estate tycoon. So he's like another Jared Kushner type. It seems very clear that the big push here from the Trump administration is that they want to do a big deal, right? And in the context of that, it's Saudi normalization, I would say, which is going to be hard, I think, given that Saudi is on the record this week basically saying that Israel is totally at fault and they are committing genocide. So it seems like, given the conversation we had last week about the Saudi security deal with the United States moving forward without Israel normalization, it would be a leap, but we'll see. I wanted to mention quickly the HR 9495, the thing that Dylan and I were talking about briefly. This is a bill that would basically allow the president to revoke nonprofit status for any nonprofit. There was an attempt to pass the bill using sort of suspension rules, which basically just means that it passes very, very quickly, and that failed a few days ago. It's worth noting that it did get a majority of the votes, but that sort of fast track version requires 2/3 of the vote, and it didn't get 2/3. It did get 52 Democrats in the House who voted for it. This bill that is basically a gift to Trump, allowing him to do whatever he wants with any nonprofit group. And so it's worth noting, I listed here the 8 California House representatives that voted for this bill, who are Democrats. And you can see included in this list is our dear future Senator Adam Schiff. And I wanted to just take a moment to reflect on that and note this chart that I saw the other day showing, how much worse Kamala Harris did than the Democratic senators who were running in those states. So like, in Michigan and Wisconsin, in Arizona, like these Democratic Senate candidates significantly outperformed Kamala Harris because like she was such an unpopular candidate. California is basically the only blue state where that worked the other way around, where like Adam Schiff performed even worse than Kamala Harris, which I think tells us a lot about his popularity and his position on things like this. But I mean, horrifying. And he's already, posting things about how as senator, he's going to resist Trump in every way possible, while literally just this week voting for a bill that would give him sweeping powers. It's important to note that that fast track version failed, but it is going up for another vote next week. So people were quick to say like victory, we won, success, but no, unfortunately, it looks like the bill is going to pass in the coming week. There's very, yeah, I mean, you know, to the extent that you can, make sure you reach out to your representatives and tell them not to vote for this. But given, you know, the makeup of the House, it's not looking great. Some BDS news, but I'll skip it for now just to say some interesting thing happening with Ben and Jerry's. A fascinating UN vote on Palestine's right to permanent self-determination in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and other places. That was, you know, 170 states in favor and only 6 against, which is the United States, Israel, Argentina under Malay, and Paraguay, and then like, you know, the Pacific Island countries that the US basically controls. The really interesting thing about this vote that's worth just a second of discussion is if you notice the historic abstainers, so like Canada, the UK, Australia, even Germany, you know, these like Western countries that are historically very, very pro-Israel, all voted for it. So I think it really tells you something about the increased isolation that's happening here. And then the last thing I want to touch on before like the big arms embargo thing is just this opinion polling that J Street put out this past week, which like I didn't even know J Street was still doing things, but here we are. Showing, among other things, among like Jewish Americans, 2-1 in favor of suspending offensive weapons to Israel and sanctioning Israeli government officials. The majority of Jewish Americans in favor of restoring UNRWA funding, and by a ratio of 71 to 29, Jewish Americans saying that like what AIPAC does to influence elections is not right. So just incredibly damning for this idea that, you know, any of this stuff is remotely anti-Semitic, and also that, you know, any of these right-wing Zionist organizations speak for American Jews in any sort of way. And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on was just this arms embargo stuff. So, you know, last week we talked about the 30-day ultimatum that the Biden administration had issued, where there's only, you know, that 30-day ultimatum ended 2 days ago on the 13th. And in that period, aid into Gaza actually went down over those 30 days. Israel made a few like really small gestures around like expanding a small piece of the humanitarian zone near like in like the southern area, uh, and then bombed that area, by the way, immediately after it did that. And so in the expectation of the administration walking back this like arms embargo ultimatum commitment, a series of humanitarian organizations, you know, including Oxfam and Mercy Corps and others, basically checked what Israel had done based on that list of demands and gave them a failing or an inadequate grade for every single piece of that letter, every single piece. You know, it's like the main thing was there need to be at least 350 trucks per day, and instead they were sending in 20 trucks per day. And so given that they failed literally everything that the Biden administration put in their ultimatum, of course, the Biden administration says they won't, in fact, be suspending any weapons. So huge shock, I'm sure, for people to hear that. The language that they used for that, of course, is like so tortured as usual. You know, in their press statements, they said they haven't made an assessment that Israel is in violation of the ultimatum. So they didn't determine that it's not in violation. They just haven't assessed that it is, right? So like it's this like kind of diplomatic wiggle room because they know that Israel is in fact in violation. So they can't say that they're not. And instead they're saying that we haven't confirmed that they are. Um, so obviously this sort of like election stunt to, you know, reduce the rancor of the way that the administration has handled the Gaza stuff has produced nothing at all. In the meantime, the thing that, you know, is still on the table is Bernie Sanders' joint resolutions of disapproval, this like push in the Senate, the first time ever the Senate is voting on arms sales to Israel. And, you know, 57 organizations have issued a letter. There's a whole push in New York that's happening. Elizabeth Warren, who was initially against it, has come out in favor of the bill. There is an incredible amount of momentum that's happening here. And what we've heard from some of the folks who are involved in this campaign is Senate offices are getting an unprecedented amount of pressure to support these JRDs. And a big part of that are these like letter writing campaigns, the like rapid phone call events like the one I talked about last week, and these postcard writing campaigns that I think are really, putting some pressure on Democratic senators to do something, or at least making them realize that to not do something will cost them something. And that includes, of course, the two California senators who, as of yet, haven't said how they're going to vote. And so, just to sum up, it looks like, the ethnic cleansing of northern Gaza is happening with no accountability. I'd encourage you to read the articles, looking at the regional stuff that was happening there. The ceasefire negotiations in Gaza basically are done. Um, uh, there seems to be confidence in the US and Israel about a Lebanon ceasefire, but at the moment it still contains that poison pill about Israel's continued military engagement in Lebanon. And of course, the US arms embargo deadline has passed with nothing happening. But that Sanders JRD is the last chance to make a big push. And so, for the upcoming actions, I posted something similar to this last week. This blue flyer on the right, for those of you who can see it, about this rapid action to block weapons to Israel, would really, really encourage folks to attend that. And you can, go to the Action Corps website to sign up for that. There's also a postcard writing campaign, so you can get information on all of this. This is the week to do it because it looks like the JRD will be submitted next week. There's also a really cool kimchi fermenting event by Nototal on Sunday, so maybe I'll see you all there. And that's it. If you want to go to other things, check out the AROC calendar. Text PSA to that number, 833-633-0604 if you want text updates. And check out the PAL Media Tracker at palmediatracker.com if you want information on the articles that inform this analysis. Thank you all so much.
Samra, that was heroic, right in the thick of time. A quarter of the time you normally have, and nearly as much information. Just two notes on a couple things you mentioned. One is to the point you made about the J Street results or the polling, and how that doesn't, reflects the asymmetry between what the far right is trying to do through the Heritage Project. Two of their stated and explicit goals are that a preponderance of Jewish community perceives HSOs, which is their euphemism for the Palestine Solidarity Movement, as a threat to their safety, and that a preponderance of a broader American public perceives the Palestine Solidarity Movement as a threat to their safety and a functioning society. And obviously, as we've seen from the polling both before the election and this new polling that you just shared, what we're doing is working, what movements are doing is working. And so the Heritage Foundation document is as much a sign of their panic, as Dylan was alluding to, as it is a sign of our strength. And so it's all the more reason to continue to push and to get involved with the push this week around the JRD. And then the only other thing I want to say about Project Esther, which was just the sort of one mind-numbing part about it, among the many, was that they close out with the Martin Niemöller quote about first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist, which is it's
Brain breaking. Yeah.
brain-breakingly cynical, because they are coming. We know that that's the first they came for the socialists isn't like we are coming for the socialists. But anyway, thanks everyone. We'll see you all next week.